Hey, you guys, welcome back to another installment here in the salon. Now, I may have brought this up a time or two before, or possibly more times than that, but I have a little bit of a fascination with film adaptations of Stephen King's works. I mean, I haven't seen all of them by any means, considering that would probably take more time than I have left remaining in my life, like on Earth. But I have seen like a decent chunk of them. And, as most people know that have, just like even a passing familiarity with all of the adaptations they've done of his stuff knows, they tend to vary wildly in quality. Let's put it like that. I mean, for every Carrie or The Shining or The Shawshank Redemption or The Dead Zone or something like that, or Misery, then on the other side of that, there's, a Langoliers, there's a Tommyknockers, there's a Dreamcatcher, there's a Mangler, you know what I mean? Most of them, though, if I'm being perfectly honest, fall kind of somewhere in the middle, just like not great, but not that terrible. Most of them are at least kind of watchable. So I was actually really interested one recent day while I was kind of scrolling through all my different streaming services looking for something to review that I hadn't really seen that was kind of maybe more, I don't know if obscure is the right word, but something like that kind of hit that sweet spot. And I noticed that Stephen King's three-part 1999 miniseries, The Storm of the Century, was available to watch on Hulu. I'm not really sure if it had just arrived like this year because I hadn't noticed it before, but I don't know how long it's been on there. Now, this miniseries originally aired on ABC back in 1999, as I mentioned, but I'm pretty sure I didn't watch it at the time. I didn't really remember anything about it. And although I didn't realize this until very recently, it wasn't actually adapted from a novel as such. Stephen King actually expressly wrote it as a teleplay. Now, the teleplay was actually published in book form not long before the miniseries was broadcast, which I think was why I always had the perception that it had been adapted from a novel like most of his other stuff, because, I've been in bookstores and I'd seen like the book version and I didn't realize that it was, originally written as a screenplay. Now, as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this might have been the first time that he'd done exactly that. You know what I mean? Where he expressly wrote something for television, like to be a miniseries. He'd done TV miniseries before, like he'd written screenplays for a TV miniseries before, of course. But they had been adapted like from his existing novels. Like, you had his screenplay for the 1994 version of The Stand, which was directed by Mick Garris, which was actually pretty good. And, also his screenplay for the 1997 version of The Shining, which was also directed by Mick Garris and was kind of hot garbage, at least in my opinion. Or at least maybe that's too mean. I guess what I want to say is that probably it just suffered quite mightily, I think, in comparison with Stanley Kubrick's, very masterful, if not entirely faithful, 1980 film adaptation, which obviously is a classic. So, anything next to that is just going to look kind of lackluster, let's put it that way. So I went into Storm of the Century with a little bit of hesitation. I mean, I was excited about seeing it because I'm always interested, like, to see a new adaptation, because it just, I don't know, like the whole concept of adapting his works, like, interests me. So, but I was thinking, well, this could go either way. This could be awful. It could be, I didn't think it was going to be great, but it's like, it could be pretty good. It could be worth watching. Now, I was actually heartened by the fact that Stephen King has often cited it as his favorite of all of the miniseries that were made from his work, so I thought, well, that's a point in its favor. Now, it wasn't directed by Mick Garris this time, who obviously has directed a lot of Stephen King adaptations, but this one was instead directed by a guy named Craig R. Baxley, who actually started out, like, back in the 70s as, like, a stuntman, a stunt coordinator on a bunch of very beloved, like, 70s and 80s action and cop shows. He was like Dukes of Hazzard and stuff like that. And then, like, he would go on to direct movies, like he did Action Jackson from 1988 with Carl Weathers, and I Come in Peace from 1990 with Dolph Lundgren, and also Stone Cold with Brian Bosworth, which came out in 1991. But in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, Craig Baxley directed a whole bunch of Stephen King adaptations, starting with this one, Storm of the Century. But then he moved on and did Rose Red in 2002, The Diary of Ellen Brimbauer in 2003, and Kingdom Hospital in 2004. Now, of those, I think I've only seen Rose Red. I might have seen Kingdom Hospital or at least seen part of it, but the only one that I really kind of remember watching was Rose Red. But I remember it being like really, really good, but I haven't seen it since it initially aired because I actually watched it when it, came on TV. I'm actually hoping to do a revisit on Rose Red one of these days, but, that's neither here nor there. For now, let's get back to Storm of the Century. So, clocking in at about 4.5 hours. It's actually 3 episodes and they're about an hour and a half each. Storm of the Century kind of utilizes a lot of the very familiar, like, classic Stephen King tropes. You got a small town in Maine, you have a creepy supernatural stranger, you have, all of this conflict causing the townsfolk to essentially, like, maybe turn on one another, and you also have kind of like this horrific moral dilemma that arises. Now, it definitely did contain elements from several of his stories, like I got a little bit of The Mist, maybe like Under the Dome or something like that, but the one it actually reminded me of the most was Needful Things, which, very much like this one, involves a mysterious stranger arriving in a small town and making everybody kind of like confront their mysterious, like, hidden selves and offering them kind of like Faustian bargains. Thankfully, though, I will say that Storm of the Century is much better than the 1993 film adaptation of Needful Things was. In fact, although I would argue, and I'll get more into this a little bit later, I would argue that Storm of the Century was maybe 60, 90 minutes longer than it maybe needed to be. It was actually, like, pretty fucking solid, I have to say. It had some really good acting performances and had a really, really terrifically bleak ending, which I actually appreciated because they don't usually do endings that bleak like in network TV, so props there. So the story is set on a fictional island off the coast of Maine, which is called Little Tall Island, which, if you know anything about Stephen King, incidentally, that's the same place that Dolores Claiborne was set. And a character in Storm of the Century actually references, like, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, what Dolores Claiborne did during the eclipse, like, is something that happened a long time ago, during the course of the story. So that was like a nice little Easter egg in there. And like I said, maybe I'll get around to doing a video about this one of these days, but there are some videos out there, like, pointing out that maybe all of Stephen King's stuff, like, happens in the same universe, and this is kind of like another, because he's always, like, sprinkling his work with, like, references to his other work like that, and this is no exception. So there's kind of, at the beginning, there's kind of like a brief prologue in which, like, the main protagonist, whose name is Mike Anderson, he's played by Tim Daly, he kind of is, like, speaking from the present day, which, was 1999, like, when this was made. And after that kind of, like, brief introduction, we're sent back 9 years to 1989 when the townspeople on Little Tall Island are getting prepared for what looks like it's going to be, like, one of the worst winter storms in living memory. Now, from these establishing scenes, kind of the vibe of the town is really nicely filled in for the viewer. It's like, this is obviously a very close-knit community. They're very used to all having to pull together, like, for the common good. And, in spite of any petty squabbles they might have with one another, they're always, like, used to kind of, like, all chipping in and doing their part. Everybody knows everybody knows everybody else's business, everybody watches out for each other. They're a little bit, like, hardened and cynical, I guess, like, because of the sort of, like, the harsh weather conditions and, like, the economic, situation and stuff, but they're, like, all, more or less, like, good people, like, very, very salt of the earth type people. But not too long into the storm preparations, I guess, like, the first ripple in the calm of the community's fabric, like, starts to occur. So there's this elderly woman named Martha Clarendon, and she hears a knock at her front door. And because this is a very, very safe town, and she doesn't really have any reason to be suspicious of anybody, like, knocking on the door, she answers it. Unfortunately, the man at her door has horribly, horribly ill intentions. So not only does he seemingly know things about her past that there's, like, really no way that he could possibly know, but after kind of, like, a bit of back and forth with her, he pretty much, like, savagely beats her to death with his cane, which is actually this very distinctive cane, which is kind of like a plot point going forward. It kind of has, like, a silver wolf head, like, on the top. So the killer, who we later find out is named Andre Linoge, who's actually played by Colm Fiore, I guess is how you pronounce his last name, who's actually like excellent here. He then very calmly like sits down in Mrs. Clarendon's living room, kind of sipping her tea and watching TV, apparently like just waiting for the authorities to show up and arrest him, presumably. And the authorities do show up in short order. They actually get alerted by a neighbor boy who sees Mrs. Clarendon's like walker out on the steps and sees the door open and thinks something's the matter. Now, the first man on the scene, though, isn't Mike Anderson, who's actually the town grocer, but also like the part-time constable, because this is like a really small town with not a lot of crime, so they don't really need a full-time police force. So this guy like is doing double duty. He's not available to come to the scene because he's been dispatched to his wife's like home daycare because a kid got her head stuck like in between the stair railings or something like that. So the first guy to actually show up at the murder house is the very officious town manager, whose name is Robbie Beals, and he's played by Jeffrey DeMunn, who was actually in a lot of Stephen King adaptations. He's kind of this very, very self-important dude who's often like pulling rank on the constable because he's just like, well, you know, I'm the town manager, so I'm your boss and I can tell you what to do. He's like that kind of, he's not a terrible dude, but he's kind of a douche like that. Now, once he goes into the house, though, and sees the mess that remains of poor Martha, and he realizes, too, that not only is the killer still sitting in the woman's house, like just chilling out, but the guy also knows like a bunch of secret shit about him as well, particularly like about his mom, like what he was doing like when his mom died in a home or whatever. Robbie is like, yeah, fuck this noise, and he just like beats feet out of there. He calls Mike, the constable, on the radio and tells him, hey, get your ass to the scene. There's actually been a murder. And like no one believes it at first. They're like, murder? What the fuck is that? Like it doesn't happen like in this small town. So they're just like, they have no idea what to do. So Mike and his friend slash deputy, you know, other guy in town that kind of gets pressed into service whenever law needs doing. His name is Hatch, and he's played by Casey Simasco. They arrest this creepy weirdo who has literally done nothing the whole time other than sitting very placidly in Martha's armchair, like just sort of smiling enigmatically at them and doling out some kind of like supernaturally divined information about their deepest thoughts or whatever. Like even though like both of the guys, like Hatch and Mike, like have guns pointed at him, he just like doesn't seem bothered at all. And he actually like allows himself to be taken away in handcuffs and doesn't resist them. And it's pretty clear that Mike, Hatch, and Robbie have literally like no idea what to do with this guy. And I mean, as I mentioned, like very clearly murder is almost unheard of on this island. And it's, you know, implied that the law enforcement here are really not prepared for anything more severe than, you know, getting a trapped cat out of a tree or some shit like that, or getting a kid's head out of some staircase railing. That's about the extent of it, because that's like all that happens. There's also the small matter of how strange this guy is. Like nobody has any clue, first of all, like where he could have come from, because there's only like one ferry back and forth and he obviously was not on it. And as the story goes on, like pretty early, it's revealed that he seems to have some kind of psychic and possibly maybe even like hypnotic or like even psychokinetic powers. So because of some possible, yeah, definitely paranormal shenanigans, Mike and Hatch are kind of like forced to march Linoge through this crowded grocery store. They're trying to get to like the rear of this building that has the jail cell in it. So they kind of have to take him through this like gauntlet of the townsfolk because, like I said, the storm is coming. So like everybody is in the grocery store like stocking up because they think the power is going to go out and all that kind of stuff. Now, while Linoge is being marched through all these people, and of course they're all staring at him because they're like, oh my God, a murderer. We've never seen one of those. Linoge starts very cheerfully airing some of the townspeople's like deepest secrets. Like, for example, like 3 of the guys had like beat up a gay man like in another town and like made the guy lose his vision. Like he knows about that. One of the girls got pregnant and got an abortion without telling her boyfriend. He knows about that. The boyfriend was actually cheating on her, like with the town slut, you know, so he knows that too. One guy is like growing a shit ton of weed like out behind his seafood market, like shit like that. Like he knows something. He's got dirt on like literally everybody. So Mike and Hatch, like they finally stash Linoge in the jail cell, but they're starting to think that maybe this guy isn't entirely human, and they're kind of like afraid that maybe he'll be able to escape, which he would be able to. You know what I mean? That's what I'm saying. So Mike basically assigns 2-man teams to like keep an eye on the dude like in shifts, while the rest of the town, because remember there's still like a horrible storm coming, so the rest of the town has to go on with the storm preparations, and you know they're becoming increasingly frenzied because this thing is getting closer and closer, and like the news is basically saying, yeah, you guys are gonna get wiped off the fucking map. So shit very quickly starts going sideways. Though Linoge doesn't appear to be in any hurry to get out of the cell, it's obvious pretty quickly that he doesn't really need to. All he basically has to do is talk to people or kind of like whisper creepily, like in this, he's like chanting and stuff like that in this kind of like soothing but also kind of evil voice. His eyes kind of start to glow red periodically, or they go black, and whoever he's talking to will basically like do whatever he suggests to them, right? So like one guy who's on watch ends up like hanging himself. Another guy who isn't even in the same building with Linoge like splits open his own face with an axe, even though this is network TV, so they don't really show that. It's just kind of like implied. And the girl who had the abortion like beats her boyfriend to a bloody pulp, like while underneath Linoge's spell, basically. So all of these deaths, it seems, are meant to send a message. And that repeated message is basically, give me what I want and I will go away. Now, this phrase is written in blood or red paint at like all of the death scenes, and Linoge himself actually repeats it to Mike and others like several times over the course of the story. Now, Mike asks him like a number of times, like, what is it that you want? Like, yeah, because we want you to go away, so just tell us what it is and we'll do it. But Linoge, rather coyly, won't really tell anybody what he wants until the time is right. Now, I did find that this kind of like thing that happened in it like got a little repetitive, and I think like dragged the story out longer than necessary, like as I mentioned before. But in its defense, like to be fair, it did tie in with one kind of like frequently echoed motif that ran throughout the series, which was, as Linoge would often say, hell is repetition. So I think that he was kind of like making a statement like that, like a little bit meta, I guess. So during the second portion of the miniseries, because like I said, this is in 3 parts, several more townspeople either off themselves or murder others, like at Linoge's behest. There's always that same message about giving Linoge what he wants. There's also like the added drama of the storm hitting and kind of like wreaking havoc on the town, like taking out the lighthouse and several of the buildings, and actually like causing some more deaths as people go wandering out into the elements, also at Linoge's encouragement. Now, along the way, Mike actually kind of figures out what Linoge's true nature might be by referencing like the biblical story of Job and implying that Linoge might be some kind of demon that was perhaps like sent here to test them. Linoge himself also makes reference to the famed like lost colony of Roanoke, which if you know anything about American history, that's what he's referring to. And he insinuates that he also had a hand in that mysterious occurrence, which happened in 1590. So when we get to the third installment, after kind of like the worst of the storm has passed, the townspeople have a meeting, like in the town hall, and discover that what Linoge wants is one of their children, essentially, one of the townspeople's children. Not as a sacrifice in the traditional sense, like you might be thinking, but more as like a protege. He's like a demonic style being, it turns out, and he's lived for thousands of years, but he's not immortal strictly, and he needs a child that he can raise as his successor, like continue his work, as he says. Now, naturally, the people of Little Tall are horrified by this situation, but they've kind of been put into what they see as like an impossible predicament. Like, of course, nobody wants it to be their kid that gets taken, but Linoge has basically told them, it's like, if you don't comply, I'm going to kill all of you by forcing you all like into the sea, just like I did to those vanished colonists like at Roanoke all those centuries ago, he implies. The residents kind of like reluctantly concede, thinking there's nothing else they can do, and Mike is actually the only holdout. In fact, I think the story is like suggesting that Mike, whose worst sin, because remember how I said like Linoge knew like the worst shit that you ever did? The worst thing as delineated by Linoge that Mike ever did was that like he cheated on a test so he could stay in college and like get his degree, which, in the great run of sins is really not all that big of a deal. And that's like the worst that he could come up with. So it's implied that Mike is the only person in town who's moral enough that would have stood any chance of like defeating Linoge, like if indeed he could be defeated. But sadly, he's never really given the chance to even find out if Linoge could even be overcome or resisted, because he's basically like outvoted and forced to capitulate, like, and go along with like the rest of the townspeople. I mean, overall, I found the Storm of the Century is very, very enjoyable, very tense, very well executed adaptation, had a really great, compelling villain. Like, Linoge was a great villain, very, very scary, and also a really capably realized like tapestry of characters that you actually did give a shit about. Also, the snowy, isolated setting adds to the real spooky vibe. I think they did actually shoot this in Maine. Obviously, Little Tall Island isn't a real place, but they did actually shoot it in Maine, as far as I know. And actually, like the storm effects, like when the Storm of the Century like hits, they look pretty damn good for like a TV production of the late 1990s. I've actually heard, I'm not sure if this is true, but I've actually heard that this TV miniseries was a little bit more on the expensive side. I think it cost 35 million, something like that. So the storm effects actually look really good. Now, unfortunately, the other CGI effects, such as the very silly like silver wolf's head like on the cane like coming to life sometimes, which kind of reminded me of like the hedge animals coming to life, like in the TV miniseries version of The Shining, which I also thought looked kind of stupid. So it has kind of that, and there's kind of scenes toward the end with Linoge like flying through the air with like all the kids because he puts them under a trance or something. They do look kind of dated and a little bit like silly, and like I said, a little bit laughable. Thankfully, though, they're kept to a minimum. They really only appear in like the third segment of the series. The first two parts are like much more realistic and don't have a lot of kind of like supernatural. There's supernatural stuff, but it's very understated. I also, frankly, could have done without Linoge having fangs sometimes. I thought he was much scarier when he was just regular looking. I mean, all they had to do was do the red eyes or the black eyes. That was enough. Like, I think he was much scarier when he was just looked like a regular person. So he didn't need like to occasionally go and like show that he had like fangs and stuff. He didn't need that. I thought that was just like a little bit of overkill, but maybe that's just me. I mean, the thing about it, the teeth came across way more like vampire than demon. So I kind of feel like they probably should have just left that off. Like I said, because the black eyes and red eyes was sufficient. Like, you knew that he was some kind of demon or supernatural being, and it was scarier when he looked normal. But I mean, really, those are just like minor nitpicks. Really, my only major criticism was the thing's length. I think this pretty easily could have been compressed into like just a normal 2.5 hour movie without losing too much. I mean, on the other hand, it was kind of nice to be able to spend some time in the town and like get to know the residents and their relationships with one another. But I did think that the middle act, like the second segment of it, was a little bit baggy, because it was kind of mostly comprised of different people in the town committing suicide or killing one another and leaving the same message behind. And it did get a little bit frustrating that the reveal of what it was that Linoge wanted was teased out like until almost the middle of like the third segment. So like I said, it could have probably been trimmed a little bit. But honestly, I mean, considering how crap like some Stephen King adaptations have turned out, and most of the time through no fault of his own, this one was actually like a really pleasant surprise. I mean, it kept me mostly engaged throughout its entire runtime, even though, like I said, I did think it was a little bit long and a little bit, it did get a little bit draggy like in the middle part. But the thing about it, like I said, it's very, very solid, very entertaining. I feel like it doesn't really get that much attention when horror fans are discussing like the various King miniseries, but it is absolutely worth watching and is way, 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 way better than the 1997 version of The Shining. And in fact, this might be a controversial statement to make, but I thought it was actually better than the 1994 Stand miniseries as well. Probably because I kind of feel like The Stand is like such a sprawling novel with like so many locations and all this complex mythology and so many characters that's going to suffer unless you have like a really, really long like series to explore that. This one worked well as a mini series because it's more confined. It was just like in one location. There was a lot of characters, but they were easy to keep track of. There weren't so many that you're like, who the fuck is this again? You know what I mean? So it was, and it was just a lot more contained. So I think it like worked better in this format. Now, as of this recording, Storm of the Century is on Hulu if you have that. So I'd absolutely recommend watching it if you're a King fan, because this is actually like a really decent adaptation. And I think you'll probably dig it if you're into Stephen King stuff. And it does absolutely need more love and attention, because I feel like not a lot of people talk about it. And that will do it for this installment. Thank you once again for dropping by the salon. Remember to like and share if you enjoy this content, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, pop on over to scaresalon.com, where I post like written content, book reviews, movie reviews, horror related stuff all the time. I put up a new post every day, so go over there and read that, and I'm sure you'll be entertained for hours and hours. And that'll do it for this video. I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.